evening. My name is Rebecca. I'm the events director for engineers and scientists acting locally. I'm just going to give a really quick overview of engineers and scientists acting locally, or ESAL. I'm going to turn it over to our partner for this event. And then we really want to spend most of the time hearing from our awesome panelists that we have on the call. So ESAL is an all-volunteer national organization dedicated to increasing local civic engagement by people with STEM backgrounds. It was founded by engineers and scientists who had experience in public policy and realized that there was this gap where there's a lot of focus on the national public policy attention, but maybe a little less so on local policy and community engagement. So that's the mission and the area that ESAL aims to fill. And we go about this in a few different ways. We have a blog series that highlights different people, ideas, and organizations that are at this intersection of science and local policy or community engagement. We have, I can post our website in the chat. We have a great set of tools and information about things like step-by-step instructions for how to get involved in different ways in local policy and other resources of local organizations that you can connect with. And then we host events just like this that again are at the intersection of science and local policy. And we've covered a variety of issues, everything from COVID to more environmental issues, and really excited for this current topic on community-led research, which is really, I think, at the heart of the type of engagement that ESAL hopes to promote. So we would love to hear more from everyone on the call and get involved. You can always be in touch. If you yourself are involved in local community engagement, we could feature you in our blog post. You can volunteer with us. There's a list of open volunteer positions on our website. And we also have a process where you can request a workshop for your organization. And one final thing I want to note is that coming up tomorrow, actually, and I'll put this link in the chat as well, we have another panel that's part 3 of this longer series we've been doing that's around kind of climate change, energy independence, extractive industries, with a focus on the impact on Indigenous lands. So if you want to join us again tomorrow, I'll give you the information for that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our partner for this event, Monica.
Hi, I'm so honored to be co-hosting this and to be a partner in this event and in this work. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to just give a little quick background of what we do. So I'm a biologist by training, and I have a public health degree. I left academia because I felt strongly that I needed more room to do advocacy. When I was in grad school, we were still on that transition, a generational transition of, do scientists take a stand or do they not? And I decided that I needed to take a stand on things. So I started this nonprofit actually in 2020 because I'm here in Louisville, Kentucky, where Breonna Taylor was murdered. And so I was an environmental justice advocate, activist, and my community was like, well, can we get information on police brutality? Can we get information on all of these other things? So I thought, well, I have tools on how to find reputable research and how to ask a better research question. So I decided to go ahead and partner with my community. So here are some of the goals, just kind of to normalize it. And so one of the things we do is I say, instead of making a protest sign that just says yes or no, put a statistic on it, put some data on it. And then the media, when they take a photo, they're going to investigate it. And then you kind of get that free labor and you've got a way to get your message out. But just sort of normalizing the use of research and data, and to ground research in reality. We have a lot of science that doesn't answer questions that we need answered. And sometimes we clean the data so much it's not realistic, or we look at one chemical at a time and not the fact that we're actually exposed to mixtures. And I love to keep the door open. So if I get into a space, I'm going to bring people with me, particularly people in marginalized populations. So this is some of our work. We're rooted in the HEMES principles for democratic organizing. So communities speak for themselves. Communities are the experts in their lived experience. We don't save anybody. Marginalized groups know what they're doing. They've survived this long, so we're partners, we're not saviors. We talk about the power of asking different questions. So what is public safety and who gets to define it? We also offer consultation services to help people plan advocacy work or how to collect their own data. We've done some tear gas research with the University of Louisville. And here are some ways that you can research or support our work. We do work here in Louisville, but we also work nationally and to some extent with global partners. And so with that, thank you for being here, and I will toss it back to Caroline.
Oh, I'm actually going to quickly take the lead in and introduce Caroline. So as I mentioned, I'm the I'm the director of virtual events at ESAL, but the person who's really done the work putting this event together is Caroline Peterson, who's a volunteer on our team. So she's a PhD candidate in chemistry at Rice University. In addition to her work with ESAL, she also is involved in a variety of science outreach in graduate school, including Girls in Science and Fun with Chemistry programs. So over to you, Caroline, to take it away for the rest of the event.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm really excited to have all of our panelists here now. And thank you, Monica, for your intro. And so to start, maybe we'll have our first panelist, Darshan, speak. Darshan is an assistant professor at the Arizona State University. He received his PhD in aerospace engineering and sustainability ethics at the University of Michigan. And I'm really excited to hear what you have to share with us today.
Hey, everybody. It's lovely to see the crowd, and I just feel very grateful for the opportunity that ESAL has provided here. I've been following what ESAL has been doing for several years now, and I'm always inspired by the events, the discussions that are led. One note before I say anything about the work that we've been doing at Arizona State University, the title of this webinar is Science for the People. And for those of you who don't know, Science for the People was a movement founded during the anti-Vietnam War days in the 1960s. That led to a lot of critical reflection on what the scientific and engineering enterprise is all about and what it's been contributing to in the United States. So for those of you who aren't aware, the history of Science for the People is extremely fascinating, and I encourage you to take a look at it. I've been at Arizona State University for a little over 5 years now. I'm an assistant professor in the School for the Future of Innovation and Society and the Polytechnic School, and I run a lab called Reengineered, which is an interdisciplinary lab that focuses on trying to center ideas of environmental protection, social justice, peace, and human rights in engineering. We work across multiple vectors. Let me go ahead and just share my screen. Hopefully you will be able to see this in just a moment. We work across a few different topical areas and intersections, including community-based engineering, environmental justice, energy and environmental governance for now, while having sort of tentacles in all of the other things that I mentioned. And we work with folks from students all the way to retired professionals. The organizational partners that we've had include academic ones, private, nonprofit, and governmental organizations, and I'll share a little bit more about some of the projects that we are working on. And in terms of outputs and deliverables, we're really thinking about the whole spectrum, from philosophy, how do we think about the work that we do? What kinds of questions should we be asking ourselves as we do this work? How do we make sense of the work that we do? To education and pedagogy, to research, and to practice. And in fact, the practice is something that's been exciting me a fair bit recently. So to help us think about what we're trying to create, which I largely have been thinking about as a field of environmentally just engineering. And that terminology kind of keeps changing in my mind, but if we think about what supports a field of work, we can think about a few different kinds of capital or resources that support a field. We can think about social capital, economic capital, of course, makes sense, right? We need financial resources to make things happen. We can think about intellectual, symbolic, and cultural capital. And so what you see on this slide are a handful of the projects that we've been doing and the ways in which we've been trying to think about how each of these projects creates the possibilities of future work. So for example, with Project Confluence, the goal of which is to mobilize more engineers and scientists across the US to do environmental justice oriented work. We've studied academic and community group collaborations in ways that have provided insight into how different kinds of community groups think about collaborations with academics, because not all community groups are the same, right? So as we think about more engineers and scientists doing community-oriented work, environmental justice-oriented work, how do we think about the nature of community groups and do the right kind of matchmaking? So through that, we're developing the intellectual and social capital that we think can build this field of engineering. As I mentioned, the practice has been exciting me a lot, and so you'll see the last bullet point under Project Confluence, which is the professional development of practicing engineers. So there we are working with engineering firms to get them to think about how to infuse principles of environmental justice in what they do, and they're making essentially a business case to do this work. So we just started an engagement with an engineering firm that we had our first interactions with in Denver. And it turns out that there's a lot of excitement on the part of practicing engineers. Again, these are not academics. These are people who work for engineering companies who feel like this work is really important to them, and they just want to figure out ways in which they can justify it in what they do. We've been working with the US Department of Energy to think about how an entire research and development portfolio can be shaped through the lens of energy and environmental justice. We've been working in particular with the Water Powers Technologies Office, and the goal there really is to think about how working with the federal agency can lead to structural change to think about issues of environmental and energy justice. Lastly, I'll just pick on the Constellation Prize, which is an effort to essentially provide or create symbolic capital to basically recognize the really, really crucial and important work that a lot of engineers and scientists are doing in promoting values of social and environmental justice in the work that they do. So to create stories and to show others that this kind of work is possible. Because only if we show that it's possible, will more and more people who might feel like this work is risky, only then will they be motivated, perhaps, or just give them a little bit of encouragement to actually take that step. So, this is kind of maybe a picture of my mind, which sort of is a representation of the way in which I think different kinds of economic, social, symbolic, and cultural resources can be built in a way to support more engineers and scientists to work with community-based organizations to continue to do this kind of work. I'll end with just some principles or thoughts that I have on what this environmentally just field of engineering can do, or what it might need. So it needs a consistent set of principles and values that provide scientists and engineers guidance on how to think about the work they do. Practices, of course, that need to align with these principles and values. A community of like-minded and self-reflective practitioners, which I think ESAL has done a wonderful job in trying to curate. And as I've been thinking more and more, we really need to figure out a way in which to make this work economically and financially viable, so that it is not relegated to volunteerism, but rather people can earn a living wage doing this kind of work that I think needs to happen more and more. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Next, I'd like to introduce our third panelist. So we have Omega and Brenda Wilson. So Brenda and Omega co-founded the West End Revitalization Association in 1995, and they've been with it ever since. Omega has degrees in radio and television studies and mass communications from Shaw University and Bowling Green State University. And Brenda has degrees in education and special education from Shaw University and Jackson State University. And they've done some really amazing work with West End Revitalization Association. I'm really excited to hear what you both have to say and share with us today.
Thanks a lot, Carol. Great seeing everybody, and finally have a chance to visit and semi whole cloth with with Monica, right? We've been emailing it back and forth for such a long time, right? The model that we're sharing with you is called Community-Owned and Managed Research Model. It's short, the initials for it is COMA, C-O-M-R, right? COMA model. We started it in about 20 years ago when the University of North Carolina students and professors of the School of Public Health were trying to show us what participatory research was relative to environmental justice issues, denial of safe drinking water and sewer services in our community. Their focus was wanting to study us, as we refer to it, as like guinea pigs. They didn't want corrective action. In fact, some of the professors pushed away after they reached out to us to bring students to work with us for 6 weeks as a part of their doctoral programs. I'll quickly mention some of those students who are now in significant positions at various universities, and they felt that professors were wrong. They got in trouble for pushing back against the professors, for farming them out as students to collect data for their classes and their books, but not for corrective actions. One of those students is Dr. John T. Cooper. He's now Assistant Vice President at Texas A&M and a liaison with HBCU universities in Texas. He uses our information and our COMA model to teach his students. And now some of those students have become assistant professors and they're teaching their students. And one of them, by the way, is working for the city of Mebane as assistant city manager, right? One of those third generation students. Another one is Dr. Jacoby Wilson. He just was promoted to full professorship at the University of Maryland, College Park. He's originally from Mississippi. Dr. Cooper is originally from Texas. So they're sharing all this information at their home grounds in numerous ways. The other one is Dr. Chris Haney. He's associate professor at Johns Hopkins University. He's taken up some of our information nationally and internationally overseas with some of the work he's done. Dr. Daria Hall Mendez is an associate professor recently at the University of Pittsburgh. The list is going on. All of these are students who wanted to work with us and believe our basic principles and how you address them. I put in a link, and I'll explain the principles in a second, but I put in a link for everybody to take a look at. This is a link that's online now. It was put online in 2015 after we challenged the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences about how they were presenting information and how they were presenting grants to various community groups, but they did not want them to implement. They were just collecting data. Of course, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, NIEHS, is the most funded research branch of any government in the world. And they did not want to address the 4 principles that I'm going to present to you in a couple of seconds. And we wanted them to be more proactive. They gave us $100,000 split. 100,000, 50 came to our organization, the Western Revitalization Association in Mebane, nonprofit, and the other $50,000 went to Dr. Jacoby Wilson after he finished his postdoc work at the University of Michigan. His first assistant professorship was at the University of South Carolina. So he's been at a lot of major universities, and he wanted to continue to work. So we were asked to vet our research model that we designed in Mebane because we thought community participatory research, the professors' push was too weak and exploitive. They gave us 2 years to do it, from 2008 to 2010. We kind of forgot about after we sent a final report. We pulled out a giant poster in our office recently that we did as a result of our vetting process to show what we were doing. In 2015, they contacted us back, wanted to know whether or not they could put our work on a website. We were saying, Jacoby and both and I were saying, we don't know what you're talking about. Can you give us an update? We're not sure what you want to put on the internet. And they said, the information you presented to us over 7 years ago, 5 to 7 years ago. We have had researchers at NIHS, they call them faculties, who've been studying your work and your information for the last 5 years. And we finally came to the decision that you're right and we're wrong. The 4 basic principles, there are 5, is funding equity. Stop funding people with Walmart cards and hot meals, and do collaborative funding where community groups receive the funding at the ground level so they can operate and not run around and drag college students and professors to people in places in their communities and people in their communities. And the university receives $1 million, $3, $4 million. Several students get PhDs. Professors get books written and lectures all over the country, and the community gets nothing. Funding equity. The second one was management parity. Obviously, management parity means the research collaboration should focus on the communities managing it and not just taking orders from the university professors. We had to dump some university professors who challenged us on that because they said that's the way it is. That's the way it was established 100 years ago. And we had lawyers to actually get them out of our office. It was very confrontational. And we asked them not to come back anymore. They decided to come back again because they felt they had a right and a privilege. And we sent the lawyers after them again and said, we'll take you to court if you continue to abuse community groups like you're doing it. And we haven't had a relationship with them since then. Our major funder, Zephyrus Reynolds Foundation, said we had a right. They funded us to have a right. And they say we have a right if you have 12 disciples. This is how they phrased it. If you have 12 disciples and 5 of those disciples are not following the book and the scripture, you let them go and you find other disciples that will fill that chair. Do not spend time arguing with them. Move on. And that's what we did. The third principle, funding equity, management parity. The third principle was compliance, for science for compliance. A lot of universities were collecting, and students have been trained to do this in a very backward way. It's collecting data for their benefit rather than basic on public health laws, public health statutes, safe drinking water statutes that are in violation where they live and where they drink and where they work and where their children play. That it should be, the data collection should be based on non-compliance and violations based on federal laws that are already in place. And there are a number of them: solid waste disposal, air quality, safe drinking water. They're all in place along with civil rights laws under Title VI and laws that protect the rights of women, right? We know that, and they've been in place for a while. So we wanted to collect the data based on laws, not based on scholarship. A lot of university professors and students did not want to do that. They felt it would jeopardize their careers. We said, you're jeopardizing our lives, wasting our time and exploiting us. The fourth principle was leveraging the data and leveraging the results for compliance and enforcement based on those statutes, existing statutes, and any new ones that would come along under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and under the Environmental Justice Executive Order 12898 that was actually pushed by Gore to get President Clinton to sign. It was one of the first things he signed when he got in office. That was in 1994. A lot of people don't realize that that was one of the issues that Gore raised with Clinton in order to run with him as a running mate. And he is not given quite enough credit for pushing President Clinton to do that. And that executive order still stands as a foundation for environmental justice issues. The fifth principle was what you might call tag team or collaborative publication, because very often publications were done after the research in communities, and the only names listed will be the professor's name, professor or professor's names,
Right.
and the senior students' names, and there wouldn't be any identifiers for the community. The only thing that would be in the published article would be pie graphs and bar graphs, and maybe a mention of the geographical city where they collected the data. They would not mention the organizations they work with them that actually gave them the information. They would not mention the names of the animes. We call them animes because we had a lot of animes in Mebane. They did not have college education, but they knew where everything was. They knew where the failed sewage septic was, the backyard septic tanks. They knew where the old mills were that were polluted, that the city and county were trying to build substandard housing developments on for poor people, pollution on top of it. They knew everything. They didn't want to give them credit. They didn't want to name them in their articles. So, nor did they want to invite them to presentations at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, at Duke University and other major colleges and universities. But we challenged that. We actually brought carloads of them to presentations so that people would see their faces, students would see their faces and respect the impacted human being who came in there suffering from cancer, suffering from asthma, suffering from other kind of diseases that they were exposed to. The link on there will give you some information. And at the bottom of that link, when you click it on as article, there are several articles that we co-wrote for Johns Hopkins University and other groups that that's only a short list, and those articles are still being used to validate our work. And that's a mini summary. Most recently, Marian Ingamalato, who is a deputy lawyer for EPA, she was with Earth Justice, she was with Yale University, asked us to present this information 2 months ago as a part of the Environmental Law Institute to recognize the community-owned research model has now been recognized as an official model by the Environmental Protection Agency after all these many years. After almost 25 years, they finally said, we want you to talk about this as a national model for all of EPA. So I'll stop there. Brenda wants to share some information, I think, about public schools as it relates to this before we move on.
Yeah. I, as the lady, what Caroline had, as Caroline has stated earlier, that I'm my master's in special education. So I've been working with those students for about almost 30, 35 years. And so I've been in several schools throughout the East Coast that don't meet up to par. I mean, they have water fountains, old water fountains that have lead pipes. We have mold, we have mildew, the carpets when you clean them. Like if the janitors clean them and they don't let them dry like they're supposed to, we come back to the classrooms to get a head start to set up our classrooms, and it smells really bad. So I'm concerned about the schools throughout the nation. And we have some school systems that are on top of it, but we have some school systems that are not as well funded as the other school systems here in North Carolina. I give one example. I worked in Orange County schools, and they are well endowed with money. But then I know another school system, Weldon City Schools, and they're close to the Virginia state line, and they're not as well off as Chapel Hill, Orange County schools, Alamance County, Guilford County schools. And a lot of their buildings are old and dilapidated, and some schools, even in Alamance County, are old and dilapidated. So I'm concerned about the school system coming to terms about taking care of the schools. A lot of those old schools are in environmental injustice neighborhoods, and they really don't care about them as much as they care about the schools that are in the white neighborhoods. So I'm concerned about that. And every time we get a chance to talk, I talk about that, since my field is in education and special education. And my concern is about those students and making sure that they get the top-notch education and facilities, and the teachers are well paid. Being a special education teacher, I was paid, but not as well as the regular classroom teacher. All the materials and things that I needed came out of my pocket. And so I don't think that's right. And they're losing a lot of teachers, and they need a lot of special education teachers, and a lot of kids are not going into that field. They're going into the field of engineering or scientists or nursing, doctors, but not in the field of education. So I would like United States and whoever else is interested in educating our kids, such as yourself. What is your first name? I'm sorry, sir. Yeah.
Darshan.
Darshan.
Yeah.
And Monica, I know you have some friends that have children, and I would like for you guys to take an interest in that.
And if it's okay, I want to hop in on what Omega talked about, because a lot of what he talked about was data justice and intellectual justice. And knowing the audience of, like, we have engineers and scientists, I just want to uplift the fact that academia has created a knowledge system based on white supremacy, patriarchy, Western European relationship to the world. So I hear a lot of academics who say, well, I don't know if we can do this. It's never been tried before. And I say, well, have we looked at the Black and brown populations who were thriving when Europe was in the Dark Ages, right? We have this idea that if it hasn't come through this filter of knowledge, which is actually, it's knowledge as defined by white supremacy, Western European patriarchy, and not Black and brown cultures and indigenous cultures. And we say, well, maybe it is there. Maybe someone did have this figured out a few hundred years ago, maybe 50 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, but we weren't taught it. So I want to say, if you're a scientist, if you're an engineer, release yourself from that pressure of saying, I have to figure this out. And instead, talk to your neighbors, go to another zip code, because they may already have it figured out. And that's when I say, with my group, everyone I work with, I say, we're not saviors. We're partners and we're servants. Because as Omega said, he clearly knows what's going on. You know, the Wilsons clearly know what's going on. And I can give you some resources on schools, especially like school building materials and schools that are in their facilities, whether they're making noise all day or whether they could explode because they're within a 3-mile zone, and how since 9/11, we don't know where all the storage tanks are anymore. So it's hard to even let people know that there's like an explosive element near your child's school, or there's lead in the play yard. But I want to make sure that as engineers and scientists, sometimes you have to unlearn how to be an academic. And as a Black woman in biology and public health who's had to prove that my prefrontal cortex is just as engaged and matched as my elder white male colleagues, I have to say, like, maybe this knowledge system is not the best. And I say one good example of that is the English language. Sometimes the English language does not describe what's happening in reality. And a lot of science is written in English. But you think, well, even within science, we still use a lot of Latin. And great, because we know English can't handle it. So maybe that's a time for us to say, maybe this Western European white supremacist patriarchal knowledge system is not the best system. So I encourage you to unlearn the parts that you need to unlearn. Look at lived experience data. Look at the data silos where we went nice, clean experiments. And before you put that pressure on yourself to say, I have to solve this, partner with someone who's been working on a solution with no money, no paid staff, nothing, and then you will see a greater return on your investment. So that's all I would say. But thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, thank you, Monica and Omega and Brenda for sharing. I think that leads really well into our discussion for the next 20 minutes or so. And I think Rebecca just shared in the chat, audience members, if you have questions that you want to raise to any of our panelists, please add them to the chat and we can discuss. So maybe to begin, and I think we just touched on this a lot, but how does maybe traditional citizen science that academics do differ kind of, you know, fundamentally from more community-led research, whether it's community-based participatory research model or like Omega and Brenda were speaking about community-owned and managed research model. And then kind of further than that, how can researchers and community groups decide which of those models really works better for their purposes?
Is that a question for us, or is that a question for the participants or attendees?
For you, Monica and Darshan, yeah, whoever wants to answer first or discuss.
Well, I mean, I can pop in and say, you have to trust the communities. You have to trust that these communities are fully human, because I think a lot of the marginalized groups were marginalized because we're seen as not fully human, right? So if you're surprised that I have 3 science degrees, then I'm going to ask you why. What is it about me, right? And we all know what it is. But I think if we have to say, I tell people, before you go to the library, go to another zip code. Because those of us in science, we know by the time you get it peer-reviewed and published, especially at the rapid pace of change in today's society with pandemics and climate change, some of that's already going to be outdated. You know, I served on an EPA panel, and their models for air dispersion and water dispersion don't include climate change. So it's already outdated. And yet we're still using that to make decisions. So we have to say, wait a minute, what we're doing does not match reality. So I think we need some humility, because I've seen researchers, they come and they study us, they don't talk to us. And then they take the data, and then they go find recommendations from other researchers and then take them back to the community. And I say, you should have taken all those recommendations back to the community to see if they sign off on them. Because instead of us going, you're welcome, this is what we did for you, we have to trust that the community knows the model. So I would even say, it's not even for us to pick the model. Some of the work we do is what we look at what the community is already doing, and we help them form it into a model. And we throw in all these fancy terms like regression analysis and all of these official, you know, elitist academic terms, so we can get it to an audience where people will think it's legitimate. But I always tell people, if you invite me to a meeting and you're just waiting for me to sign off on what the community already told you, I'm going to be in a bad mood, and it's going to be a very tense meeting, because they already told you what needs to be done. I shouldn't have to attach these figures and these fancy multi-syllable words to it to say the reality is we have to stop poisoning people, and we have to stop normalizing acceptable suffering and sickness and death, so that someone, whether it be a shareholder or someone in the global north or someone in a wealthier zip code, can profit. So I think there's trust the community, and that we as scientists have to stop being complicit and saying, well, this is within acceptable risk, or this is the best experiment, so we're going to look at one chemical at a time. Just be honest and say, look, we don't know how to look at mixtures yet, but you know, help us push for funding so we can get there. Instead of just being like, well, we're just going to have to go with this, and sorry if you die. That's what it is.
We have some thanks a lot, Monica. we're comparing your spirit to our friend that we've known for 20-some years now, Dr. Jacoby Wilson. It's a blessing. I have some things to add relative to some very important conversations we had today on the national scale with United States congressional leaders and EPA officials out of Region 4 and Region 6. But I'll save that a little bit, because we're circling back around, and we wanted Darshan to have a chance to put some more meat in the sandwich. All right. Then I'll come up with some chips and some dips right after he gets through.
So I'm not an expert on really understanding the nuanced differences between citizen science, CVPR, and COMR. One thing that I will say is one project that we are in the process of completing has actually taken a hybrid approach where, so the counterpoint to community-owned and managed research is university-managed research. And what we did was created a bit of a hybrid model to sort of leverage the benefits that come from being associated with the university, which could be access to certain kinds of resources, with a COMR model. And what we did was we created a bit of an umbrella where folks like me and a postdoctoral fellow did a lot of administrative work to support the community-owned and managed research projects in what they wanted to do. And so the really interesting thing that came out of that, or one of the interesting things that came out of that, was we facilitated 4 community-owned and managed research projects under this umbrella of sorts of a university-managed research project. And one of the benefits of doing it that way was the way in which the community-owned and managed research projects were actually able to collaborate with each other across their projects. So it was set up in a way where the community groups that were leading certain projects did not feel like they were alone in doing what they were doing, but they were able to learn across multiple projects that we were sort of helping shepherd along. So point is simply that, you know, there are, as Monica said, an essentially infinite number of ways in which you can kind of structure these kinds of research projects and models. And I don't think it's necessarily about saying I'm going to do CBPR versus I'm going to do citizen science versus COMR. In reality, you sort of have to create the model based off of what works best for the community that you are engaging with. I actually have a question for Omega. Can I ask a question? I had a question about one of the principles regarding science for compliance. You know, as time has gone on, we have learned about ways in which even the standards that are set by the EPA they are problematic in and of themselves, right? Like, how are the standards for lead in blood set? How are the standards for dioxin exposure set? So can you say a little bit about ways in which COMR or citizen engagement has affected the ways in which those standards are set, such that the science that is done for the compliance is actually, it's not, the science isn't justifying the current standard, which we know is problematic, but rather making the standard stronger and stronger?
For the question, that's a super question. The first thing I want to say, don't let me get wordy and forget your question. But the first thing I want to say is bring us back to what connected us to this team. And that was, my wife and I were asked to be people to help integrate the higher level of the Citizen Science Association. Starting back in 2017, the Citizen Science Association was going to have a international conference in Raleigh, in downtown Raleigh. 2 years before that, that was in 2015, but they pulled out because the city of Raleigh, under the former mayor, several mayors ago, very conservative, decided that he was going to create a bathroom bill that was going to discriminate against transgender or the gender diversity issue. They were just going to throw it in the trash as if it didn't exist, and then we're going to arrest people. And they pushed it all the way to the state legislature, so some other cities adopted. The Citizen Science Board decided to push back against that, and they refused to have their meeting in Raleigh. 2 years later, They had to come back to Raleigh because they reserved all these big hotels in downtown Raleigh, and they had $250,000 that they would lose, they would forfeit if they didn't have the conference. So they decided they were going to have the conference 2 years later because they would lose all this money. And also they wanted to create some level of diversity, which included color and gender. And we had some of those connections. So we worked on it for 2 years. But in any case, we had to push the Citizen Science Board because we met with them face to face over a period of 2 years in the Science Museum in downtown Raleigh, right across from the History Museum, right across from the state legislature, right across from DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, which is the state branch of EPA. Some of those board members did not want us there. They were all white. They thought we have no right to be there. But the leader of the executive director, her name is Jennifer Shirk. She's an ornithologist from Cornell. She pushed it and wanted us to stay. There's another lady by the name of Dr. Karen Cooper, Karen C-A-R-E-N, not K-A-R-E-N. She's associate professor. She's easy to find on the internet at the North Carolina State University in the Department of Forestry, right? They said it's time to change institutionally. And they didn't want to just plan the meeting and just ask a few Black folks to come. They actually pushed the board that we would be involved in helping plan the meeting. And I don't want to kind of tell you what some of those internal meetings were like, but there were a couple of times we were going to just walk out, right? We did not walk out because a lot of Black folks just didn't want to be bothered with this white craziness, as they call it, right? But we decided to stick and stay. But we demanded some things of the Citizen Science Association. There was a grant from the National Science Foundation. It was co-written by Dr. Shakobi Wilson, that I mentioned earlier. He's the African-American person, so for those who you do not know. And also Dr. Karen Cooper. It was $50,000. And my wife and I were asked to recruit through our various networks, 12 networks, people of color. So we recruited people that we knew and people that had connections with people we knew from Puerto Rico to St. Lawrence Island, Alaska, right? And they came. And also people from New Orleans to California, to Texas, to Michigan, et cetera, and they were there. And we asked them to address environmental justice in a formal way. The biggest event was a dinner, which was one of the closes of it on a Friday night after 3 days meeting. The whole thing was like 5 days long. At the convention center in downtown Raleigh. They wanted us to give us a tiny dinner. We pushed and fought internally. They gave us a dinner so everybody could see what EJ communities were talking about. Rather just the EJ community people talking to each other, we already knew each other. You know, we were in all these other kind of meetings. So they finally acquiesced after some very, very hot meetings. They thought nobody would want to come to see what Black and Latino people and Alaskan people were saying, but they did. It was over 800 people there. It was overflowing. 28 countries and 50 states were represented. It was the biggest event for the whole conference. The things that our organization asked for is formal approval of community-owned and managed research model. This past January, now this is 2022 now. This is 3 years later. The board finally, after much consternation, approved what we call the WERA's MOU-MOA, Memorandum of Understanding and Memorandum of Agreement, in a formal letter. And that letter was shared with Jessica Thomas, and Dr. Adrienne Hollis, who used to be a member. She has a law degree and a PhD degree in science. She used to be a member of a staff member for Union for concerned scientists, right? We had dinner last year, about a year ago this day, with Jessica Thomas down in Duplin County to talk about these issues. And we were trying to push the Union of Concerned Scientists at least to adopt what the Citizen Science Association adopted, because they formally adopted our memorandum of understanding and memorandum of agreement. They do not have to write it, it's already written. We wrote it 20 years ago for our local community to deal with scientists coming in our community. And we edited a little bit to be more inclusive of Indigenous people and Latinx people, okay? So we did that. They formally approved it after a big fight over a period of 3 years. They threw us out, we came back, they threw us out, we came back. We said, we do not want to be invited to the Citizen Science National Conference and have a one-off. You're not going to get rid of us. So we developed an environmental justice practitioners working group, and it's still in operation, right? As a part of the Citizen Science Association. That particular document is the document that connected us to this particular group. That needs to be recognized. I don't know, Carolyn and other people, Rebecca, Jessica, and others can put their hands on it and send it to everyone, right? The bigger piece to go, I'm gonna circle back around to what the question that Sean asked. This morning, well, 1 o'clock, more than quite this morning, who asked to be on a call with U.S. Congressperson Rahul Gahova. He is a senior and a veteran, I think 20 some years from Arizona. He asked me and some other environmental justice leaders to be on a call with him to present the new rollout of the Environmental Justice for All bill in the House of Representatives. It was written and rewritten. There was another bill called the Environmental Justice Bill that we have input on with Senator Cory Booker, right? So there was 2 different EJ bills, but they want us to be on, as a part of this process with a lot of EJ communities. One of the things he clearly stated, and one of the things we push on, is that science must be used in such a way that community groups are not pushed away from using the science for legal leverage. And he made it very clear this afternoon at 1 o'clock that is included in the bill. Some of the things that we pushed for 20 years ago was included in that bill. It's a bill, it's not law. And that community groups like ours have a right to use their data for legal leverage to correct their problems. Now, this is institutional barriers in EPA, institutional barriers at colleges and universities. Now they're saying we want to bridge that gap. And we want to let you know, since you weren't on part of that call, that you need to understand wherever you are at colleges and universities, we're working on making it law to make it illegal for you to stop us from leveraging our legal right. And we have a right to file legal action against you and attorneys when you try to, and universities, when you try to stop us from using data that we collect with you or without you to address our legal rights. That was a big meeting. The hour before that, we were in a meeting with the research leaders at the EPA Region 4, which is the region we're in, which is the blackest region of EPA. That is the southeastern region, 8 states, what we refer to as the former slave states, with the most people of color and a large indigenous tribal representation and a tremendously growing Latino population, right? That meeting was to talk about new grants coming from the federal government to fund organizations like ours to keep them operating. And they are creating a new level of grants that they fought against us doing 20 years ago. And the grants will be used to leverage compliance and enforcement coming from EPA for the first time formally. That's sorry, isn't it? The Office of Environmental Justice would not allow us to get justice. And we filed complaints against EPA, even though we were working with EPA, because they were stopping us from doing what their office said they're supposed to be doing. This has to do with politics, right? And a lot of government people wanted to cover their asses and they thought they would get fired if they actually did what they were supposed to do in writing. So now, 20 years later, they're saying, yes, we can do this after all of this time. And they ask us to be a part of that conversation to announce the rollout of these grants coming in the next few months, that there's an inclusion. But a lot of people don't trust EPA. They don't trust the federal government because of previous work. So they ask us to be a part of the rollout to recruit new groups, because you got to figure some of the people who are coming in now weren't even born when the organization was started 30 years ago. Dr. Beverly Wright in New Orleans was there, and we both were saying amen. We both were saying lawyers need to be a part of your collaborative partnership, even if you are with a university. If you don't have lawyers as a part of your team to look at corrective action after the data from the beginning, Darshan, then you're failing. You're failing and you're exploiting. You need to have lawyers as a partner. You have lawyers at the university, where often your schools have law schools, and obviously there are environmental lawyers that are pro bono that will assist if you ask them. Earth Justice has lawyers. Environmental Defense Fund has lawyers. The Center for Biodiversity has lawyers. Sierra Club has lawyers. All of those organizations have lawyers. If you reach out to them, they will provide pro bono legal assistance to you. And don't tell me your faculty members don't want it. You make it very clear that now is the time to do that, because it's coming from the federal level. And you must do it, or you continue to exploit, and you continue to evade, and you continue to treat us like guinea pigs. We need to stop it and stop using the academic world as an excuse for we can't do it because my dean says I can't do it. You need to inform and sit down and talk to your dean about what's happening today, and not 15 or 20 or 30 years ago. Thank you for allowing me to preach. I hope a few people are baptized.
Darshan and Monica, if you have anything to add to the conversation here, then you're welcome to. If not, as we approach the end of the event, I think we'll have closing remarks.
I would just want to remind everyone that we have a privilege when we have these initials behind our names. So when you're in these spaces, make sure that you are sending the information out to the communities that are disproportionately impacted. Make sure you are uplifting their lived experience. You're uplifting that we need to have health data with this environmental exposure data, and hold people accountable. Don't rely on thresholds. Industries are using our thresholds and our LD50s to make excuses for pollution. So why in the world are we getting mad when communities are using our data to sue for the right to survive? So we are trained to be arrogant to an extent. We are trained to question. Use it to help keep your community alive.
And I'll just say that based off of the folks who I've been interacting with, from students to retired professionals, people are really passionate about these questions, and they are just figuring out ways in which to mobilize. And so I think there's significant opportunity for us to create new kinds of structures, new kinds of collaborations to get more and more people involved. I really, really, really believe that firmly.
And then finally, any last words from Brenda and Omega before we log off?
I just want to thank you for inviting us to be a part of this, and thank you for the connective people like we mentioned, Jessica and Dr. Adrian Hollis, who connected us in this path, you know, a couple of 3 years ago, early in the COVID-19. And just say that right now we're in the process of getting formal policy endorsed with some of these issues by the American Public Health Association. Some of our work has been formally endorsed by the United Church of Christ. For those who do not understand, the United Church of Christ was part of the major institutional instrument that helped formally recognize environmental justice. And 30 years ago, 31 years ago this year, the United Church of Christ was a part of the team that put together the first Environmental Justice Summit with a very diverse population in Washington, D.C., with hundreds of people. And a lot of people do not know that. If you Google our name, the Omega and Brenda Wilson United Church of Christ, then you will find that some of that information posted with us. There are some articles that are being published now that include Dr. Brandon Hunter, a graduate from Duke University in environmental science and environmental engineering, who is currently writing articles relative to the gap in the cultural barrier in engineering, because engineering builds water and sewer, they build streets, but they build it with bias. And he asked us to be a part of an article along with some other people to challenge the engineering area, because they've been watching other parts of the science, public health science, and figured that they were going to get a buy. They don't need to be involved. They're not racist. We're not racist. We're good. We're good. But he is saying no, that they should be addressed and challenged also to be a part of this. Because once we find the solutions, then they have to build it. And engineers, structural engineers, are a major part of this. They're part of the city planning process, state planning process, and they're part of the trillion dollar bipartisan infrastructure bill. So some of them are going to get filthy rich doing this work without addressing environmental justice and the harm that's going into communities. I just want to say that, and Brenda is going to have something to say too.
I just thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to speak to you. I just want the engineers and the scientists to be more human and think about the communities that you're embracing or you want to work with, and think about just put yourself in their shoes. And as Monica said, let that academia go away for a while, put yourself in their shoes and see what they're dealing with, and see how you can help them take that problem away or deal with that problem on a legal standpoint of view to help them have a better life just like everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists for this conversation. I think it was really insightful and really necessary for us today. And thank you to the audience for joining us. We'll send out a follow-up email with some links to some resources if you want to stay connected with everyone here. But thank you, everyone.
Peace.